You know, it's kind of insane to imagine that just a year ago, I decided to finally start dabbling more into the Final Fantasy franchise after my 10 and 15 videos. After that, I went into this more and more, and surprisingly enough, some of these games became some of my favorite RPGs I've played in recent times. And I've also had some absolutely terrible experiences I don't want to reminisce on. Now, with all of that said and all of those played, we're finally here talking about probably the single most controversial Final Fantasy ever made in the form of Final Fantasy XIII. A title so divisive amongst the fanbase that some argue that this is not only the single worst game in the franchise, but it's what 100% contributed to the downfall of the series for many OG fans. But at the same time, as the years have gone by, others have gotten over their dislike of the game, and now actively consider it one of the most underrated games Square has ever put out, and constantly call for it and the rest of its trilogy to be remastered on modern consoles. Since nowadays the only way you can really play this is either through playing it on Steam with its pretty subpar PC ports, or play it through Xbox. Although, if I can be completely honest here, this was the Final Fantasy I was probably the most excited to finally play because I've said it before, but I love getting my hands on divisive titles. And after finally beating the game, I can confidently say that this is probably the single most mixed I've been on a Final Fantasy game, like, ever. Final Fantasy XIII is home to some of this franchise's highest highs, but at the same time, it also has some of its lowest lows. And I'm going to take this video to talk about both. What I loved about it, what I hated about it, and more importantly, trying to clear up some of the misconceptions I think people have about the title. With all of my yapping done, let's get into it. Like how most of my videos go, I'm going to start up with all of the things I loved about this game before getting into the negatives. First and foremost, this game looks fucking beautiful. If you had shown me this game without any prior knowledge that it was released nearly 20 years ago, and then just straight up told me it came out last year, I'm genuinely certain I would have believed you. It still kind of blows my mind that we're nearly 2 decades away from the hardware it released on, and it still looks as good as some of the modern titles that come out today. Like, I can't sell people enough on how well Final Fantasy XIII has aged in terms of both cutscene direction and character animation. It's able to hold up immensely well, even to some of the juggernauts in the industry that have dropped today. Like, you may think I'm over exaggerating, but just watching some of these cutscenes like the invasion of Cocoon, or the big opening one where Lightning takes on all the guards, or even stuff like the simple slow movements when they're on Grand Pulse just talking with each other, not a single scene looks bad or aged in the slightest. The engine that they used for this game, for all its faults and limitations that we will talk about later, was able to make a timeless looking game as a result. And I gotta give a massive props to the team for that, especially since a lot of games from this particular era of RPGs and just gaming in general don't get to share in that kind of praise. Looking at you, Infinite Undiscovery. However, graphics aren't the only thing that sticks out about this game, as the combat was another aspect of it that I found rather interesting. So how about we start getting into the gameplay? So full disclosure here, I do have some pretty big issues about the gameplay of 13. Shocker, somebody has a problem with the gameplay of this title. But in truth, I don't actually think it's as bad as other people say it is, and I wanted to spend some time talking about the stuff that I think was genuinely good about it. For one, I really like the idea behind the shift mechanic. So how this whole shift thing works is that you have the option to customize your team of 2 or 3 characters based on the skills of them known as Ravager, Commando, Medic, Saboteur, Sentinel, and Synergist. All of them function in vastly different ways. Commando and Ravager focus on dealing damage, Sentinel can be used to provoke enemies and severely reduce damage alongside counterattacking, Medic is, well, Medic, that's pretty self-explanatory, and Synergist and Saboteur focus on buffing and debuffing. And a big aspect of how you play this game is depending on the build you can do with each of these classes. You can make a party of Ravagers with 1 Commando to focus on maximizing damage. On the other side, if your team is in trouble and on the brink of death, you can focus on making 2 characters healers and 1 a Sentinel, so 1 can focus on taking the brunt of attacks while you heal everybody up. And then you can put 2 Synergists together with a Saboteur, so that they're double timing adding buffs to the party while the Saboteur focuses on weakening the enemy. And while at the start of the game you can feel kind of limited in your options, once you get further into the title, everyone can start using the same kind of shifts, which can open up your creativity for combinations even more. All of this, however, is built around the other major gameplay mechanic, and that is the introduction of the stagger meter.
Yeah, so in case you were a little out of the loop, Final Fantasy XVI was not the title to introduce stagger meters to Final Fantasy. That was 13 that did this. And while it does function similarly to 16's, where breaking it allows you to deal heavy damage to the enemy, it has another function that I actually really like, wherein the more you increase the percentage number of the stagger gauge, the more damage you start doing to the enemy you're facing. I really like that. That's an interesting thing to do. It also helps that certain form shifts are better for building up the stagger meter. Like Ravager being able to build it up faster, but it goes down just as fast, so you need a commando to make sure it stays where you send it. And commandos can do a lot more damage to stunned enemies, but at the same time, they can't really fill up the gauge all that fast. It's a good idea that admittedly is very satisfying to pull off. And then, once you defeat the enemy, you gain what are known as crystal points to spend on your Crystallium, which gets you bonuses like increases to your strength, health, or magic, alongside netting you new skills or stronger spells. All in all, it's a fairly solid system. It has some pretty big flaws that I'll be going over later, but for a highly experimental system, I think it gets the job done okay enough. With that said, let's wrap up talking about the gameplay and get to the game's story and, more importantly, its characters. Now, this was the main thing I was honestly the most apprehensive about next to the combat when it came to this title, because I have heard nothing but horror stories about how bad this main cast was. Like, so many people say this title was just basically an insult to the writing of the Final Fantasy series. And all I gotta ask after experiencing it for myself is like, where are these bad characters? Because this cast was insanely good. Like, I'm not kidding when I tell you that I think this might genuinely be one of the best casts Square has ever created. And there are so many misconceptions about these characters that it kind of blows my mind. For one, no, Lightning is not a female Cloud. Their arcs are vastly different, and the only thing they share is being kind of stoic at points. Lightning's whole arc is basically how, due to her parents' death, she had to harden her heart and become the rock her family, or most importantly, her sister, needed to survive in this world. Unfortunately, that hardness ended up creating a rift between her and her sister, to the point where she was willing to threaten her when she learned she became a l'Cie, and she has to spend a majority of the game realizing how wrong it was to act that way. It ended up consuming her, and it basically made her into the worst version of herself. And things like hatred and revenge are never going to make her truly happy. And in the end will just lead her down a continuous cycle of destruction. Then you have a character like Snow on the other side, who starts off as the plucky, happy-go-lucky hero that everybody's supposed to love. But what's interesting about his storyline is that it goes on about how his mindset is rather toxic, considering that throughout his time trying to be the hero, he's never really thinking about all the lives he's indirectly ruined as a result of his actions, and just continues to run away from them. His actions constantly cause people problems, and you see how it wrecks people's lives firsthand through the character of Hope. Someone who I remember everybody hating as a result of his much more cynical mindset. But in reality, I think he's the best written character in the game because of his own personal journey. For as negative as he is, you kinda can't blame him for thinking this way, considering that in the span of like 3 hours, he's ripped away from his home, watches his mom die in front of his eyes, sees the guy who gets her killed laughing like an idiot, proclaiming himself a hero, acting like he didn't do anything wrong, and then, through no fault of his own, is branded a super terrorist and dragged into a war he wanted no part in. I think it's very reasonable he's angry and bitter. I don't blame him for straight up having a meltdown the way he does. Things get so bad for him that he starts believing that the only thing worth living for is revenge on Snow for killing his mom, and as a result, follows around Lightning believing she'll make him strong enough to take him out, which indirectly causes arguably one of the best written dynamics in the entire series between these two, and I will fully stand on that. Watching these two go from reluctant traveling partners to teacher and student, and later on developing a sort of big sister, little brother, or even mother-son bond, was arguably one of the best written back and forths the series has ever had. Moments like Hope having a near mental breakdown when Lightning finally gives up on her anger and rage, believing that she's just abandoning him due to just how much of a lifeline her mentality has become for him, along with him finally confronting Snow, leading to some of the best moments in the entire franchise. A lot of these characters are just really bitter and miserable. And personally, I think the negative behavior is one of the reasons that this whole party pushed people away from them. These are not a group of plucky, fun-loving heroes with their own mental issues. This is a group of cynical assholes who are forced into a battle they want zero part in, and as a result, act in very realistic ways. Like, they get mad, they yell and assault each other, they blame others for their own issues. I can kind of understand why it would push people away though, as I don't think many gamers want to pick up a game and spend hours watching these guys just be angry all the time. But, on the other side, I think that's what helps these characters reach such fantastic conclusions. Lightning learns to finally not let her anger and coldness rule her life and let people in. Hope learns to move forward and keep living while not letting revenge cloud his judgments. Snow comes to understand that his actions do have genuine consequences on people and strives to do better. Saz learns to move forward after losing his son due to him unfairly becoming a l'Cie. Vanille learns to stop running from her problems. These character arcs start off miserable and bitter, but by the end of the game, feel the most satisfying to see concluded. Don't get me wrong, like I said before, I can definitely get why this more cynical mindset for the characters pushed a majority of the fans away, but I also think it's kind of a shame that these wonderful characters don't really get the time to shine because a lot of people bounced off them at the start. If I can get through anything with this video to people, I really hope I can convince them to give this cast another shot. Because trust me, they are so much better than they are first shown, and I think they will actively climb your list of favorites. And while the characters are easily the highlights, I also ended up really enjoying the story as well. The idea of following a group of super terrorists as the world rejects them due to all the shit they were told by the higher-ups is fascinating. The further you get, I love a bunch of the narrative twists. Some ended up genuinely catching me off guard. But I also wouldn't really say it's my favorite story in the franchise. Although, man, it and how the characters reacted did end up keeping me very invested. Of course, it's also helped that it's accompanied by arguably one of the best scores of the modern Final Fantasy era, maybe even the entirety of Final Fantasy itself. Originally, the music was meant to be composed by the OG GOAT himself, Nobuo Uematsu, but some stuff came out and he wasn't able to do it, so they replaced him with Masashi Hamasu. And while I would have liked to see an Uematsu track, would have been like with this game, I gotta admit, Masashi does a phenomenal job with this game's OST, because it is a knockout of the fucking park times 10. Tracks like Blinded by Light and A Battle Return are definite standouts. My favorite track has to be Rebellion Against Fate. This absolutely bombastic music track that was so good, I had to change my pants afterwards. Even if by the end of the video you have no interest in playing Final Fantasy XIII, you should at least do yourself a favor and go listen to Rebellion Against Fate. Man, it is godly levels of music. And, well, that's all I really have to say about the pros. I hope I was able to get across why some of these characters deserved a second chance among the fandom, as I genuinely think they're fantastic. But for every video with pros, cons must come after. So let's get into those now. So, when it comes to the pros of Final Fantasy XIII, I wanted to explain and go on as long as possible on why I think it does have its strengths. I want to be sure that I'm putting my foot down that I do think this game has a decent amount going for it, that a lot of people end up looking over. That said, I do think this game has some pretty big flaws, so let's start talking about them. Now, was there any problem with graphics? No, there was not. In fact, I can easily say the most consistent part about this game was how good it looked. Well, what about the story? Just like the characters, I think it's arguably one of its strongest points. So I don't really have complaints about it either. Well, outside of one, and that's the main thing you're supposed to defeat, known as Orphan. Personally, I don't think it's a very interesting final villain. I guess it's more just meant to be something that you're supposed to fight and it's like a concept. But in all honesty, I kinda wished the final boss was instead the Pope dude you fight, Balthadir. He was just so much more interesting to me as an antagonist and as the mastermind manipulator behind everything. I just really wish we got to see more of him, as honestly, every other antagonist you run into in this game is just undercooked as a result. Like, for example, there's this big titty bitch who uses Saz's son to trick him and then basically forces him to watch as he turns into crystal. Then she drops this gigantic reveal about Vanille, and I really expected with all of the shit she was pulling, she would end up being one of the bigger threats for this game. She's just this massive asshole, and you're like, alright, when you finally run into her in one of the later chapters, like, yeah, let's kick her fucking teeth in. But you don't get to do that. She just gets kicked out, and you never see her again. I don't know if she shows up in, like, one of the side content hunts towards the end, but, like, wow. You never see her again for the main story after that. And that kind of sucks, because that would have been a really fun boss fight. Like, they build up this super hateable character, and they're just nah. Other than that, I don't really have any complaints about the story. So now I'm going to get into what is the center of most of my complaints. And that is, without a doubt, the gameplay. Now, I have stated earlier that there are aspects of the gameplay I do think are actually pretty great. The Patagrim shift mechanic is a really cool idea, and can make for a fun basis for some pretty good strategy. However, that's when you actually have to utilize it. And sadly, for most of the game, you don't have to, and it becomes arguably one of the most dull combat systems I've ever taken part in. Having all of those abilities to use at your disposal is cool, but they come with that major problem. Outside of boss fights, you don't really have to utilize much of the shifts. Things like Saboteur, Synergist, and Sentinel are all cool in concept, but for like 80% of the game, you don't even have to touch them because of how abusable Ravager and Commando are. Like, a combination of these two shifts can just straight up abuse the stagger gauges to where you can multiply your damage and finish everything off without them. And whenever you get hurt, all you have to do is swap over to Medic and you get healed really fast. The gameplay loop in and of itself is supposed to encourage a mix of attack and defense, but it kinda doesn't. It more often than not just ends up shooting yourself in the foot, as half the shifts you learn don't matter outside of some boss fights. Hell, later into the game you gain skills like Renew or Dispelga, which makes swapping to the Medic even less needed outside of certain fights. And before you ask about the uses outside of battle, there isn't. You just get healed after every fight, so you never really even need to utilize it outside of battle. Plus, there's also the other major factor of how absolutely broken Phoenix Downs are in this game, to the point where they replenish nearly your entire health bar upon a single use, is just kind of hilarious. Like, don't get me wrong, like I said, this combat system works really well in boss fights, but normal encounters get immensely dull by like the 8th chapter. Although I think it is at its absolute worst in the final dungeon, where every single encounter feels 5 times spongier than necessary just for the purpose of dragging on the final dungeon, and fights start wearing you down to the point where everything feels more like a slog than usual. It honestly might be the worst final dungeon I've experienced since, like, I'd probably have to say Final Fantasy III. And that isn't where my complaints with gameplay end, as there's also other stuff that gets on my nerves. First of those is the little animations that actively make the gameplay experience worse. I'm usually someone who loves those little animation details in games. They can add on a bit of polish that makes these titles feel like a bit more of a special experience. But in 13, they actually end up just hurting the experience overall. The first one is when characters will do this little animation at the start of the fight whenever you shift. And it's a cute little thing, and it's charming at first, but you immediately start hating it because you realize that this is a structured ATB style game, and as a result, when you do this, battles don't stop, so you can actively take damage whenever it happens. Basically, playing this game how it wants you to will just make the game give you a giant fucking middle finger at points and say, here's some free damage. It feels like the game is punishing me for trying to follow its rules, and that kind of pisses me off. Like, why am I punished for following your rules? That doesn't seem very fair. This also ends up affecting healing, as in order to heal a party member, your character has a whole ass animation dedicated to turning around and casting the spell in their directions. But this just takes more time and leaves you open to more damage. I feel like they were trying to replicate the original ATB Final Fantasy games where higher level spells took longer to use them, but I'm not using high level spells. Throughout most of this game, you're just casting Cure and Cura. So for some reason, these animations for minor spells take as long as Kurga could, which is just stupid. I don't know why they added this in. My guess is for a little bit of realism, but in reality, it just fucks over the experience. I do admit though, I like how you can cancel the ATB gauge at any time and save up for a different move. That's a nice addition. It adds a little strategy to battles, and it's really cool. Especially since your party members can be kind of unreliable from time to time. There would be moments where I would have Hope and Lightning tag team a staggered enemy, but then Fang would be over there beating up other dudes when we were just trying to kill this guy. Like, can you fucking focus, you goddamn wild girl? Alongside that, there were these little things like the Crystallium getting ridiculous amounts of points for late game upgrades. Kind of baffling for me that I have to pay 10k crystal points just for a magic plus 15. Or it does that stupid bullshit where if the party member you're controlling dies, that's an immediate game over. I hate that with a burning passion. Even in games I love like Persona, I cannot stand that mechanic. I pray every day it'll stop being a thing, as it's basically just artificial difficulty. And that's pretty much all I really have to say about the complaints for combat. So now it's time to talk about my complaints about how overly linear this game was. Oh man, the term hallway simulator does fit this game perfectly. Because holy shit. Like, don't get me wrong, I knew that this game was a bunch of hallways. In fact, part of my Versus 13 video that I made a long time ago was talking about the main reason that 13 was so linear was because the engine they utilized could make those linear areas very pretty, but big areas it couldn't really render a whole lot of. That's why you only get one in the game. But holy fuck, I did not think it was this bad. Keep in mind, I had not played it by then, so I didn't really know. I was just going off data I had read. And Jesus Christ. I want to make something clear, though. I don't mind linearity. Honestly, most Final Fantasy games themselves are kind of linear, even ones I love like 10. But why does 10 get a pass from the fandom and not 13? A lot of people say favoritism, and to be fair, that is kind of true. Some people are a bit biased. I think a big issue comes down with its execution. With 10, they at least do a good job hiding the linearity with stuff like extra dungeons, minigames, and blitzball. Even if you don't like that stuff, you can play it pretty much at every save point. Alongside that, there are several towns and shops to go to. 13 has none of these things. It's just going down one path, fighting enemies, story cutscene, rinse and repeat. If you get lucky, maybe once every 3 chapters you'll get an alternate route that goes to some treasure, and even then it's over in a minute. The only time you get any sense of open freedom is in chapter 11 of 13. Yeah, you don't get an open area to explore until you're almost near the end of the game. And even then, the most you can do here is just fight enemies and do some side missions that are just fighting enemies. Like, you could at least offer a fucking minigame or something. Jeez, man. I had to wait until near end of the game to get some freedom that wasn't a hallway, and all you give me is just dirt and enemies? Come the fuck on. Hell, once chapter 11 is over, you just go back to the hallways again. Apparently, though, the sequels do end up fixing these issues, and when I finally get around to them, I'm hoping that's the case. But as it stands on its own game, 13 is just very poorly handled with its linearity and its combat. And as much as I love the story and characters, I can't overlook those massive flaws. With that said, those are my complaints. So let me get on to my final thoughts.
Final Fantasy XIII is a weird one. After finally getting around to playing this game, I had originally believed that I was going to walk away from it with a much more concise feeling. But truth be told, I'm still really split on how I feel about it as a game. For everything that I think it does absolutely perfectly, some gameplay aspect comes up and genuinely upsets me to a point where I just dislike the game more. Does it deserve the hatred it's gotten? Not in the slightest. However, I do think it is a very flawed title. It's certainly not the worst, but it's far from being the best. And that's why I think it deserves an overall rating of 5.5 out of 10. And that's it. After what feels like over a year of these games, I'm now done with every single mainline single-player Final Fantasy. What a journey it's been. I wouldn't say every moment of this journey has been super high quality, but it's been definitely one I won't be forgetting for a while. I got a few more videos after this one related to the franchise, then I'm probably going to take a break from it. Probably get around to Golden Sun, or do another ranking video, who knows. And if you want to check out any of that stuff, or any of the other content I got planned, do me a favor and like and subscribe down below. Leave a comment to help me in the algorithm, or if you want to chat about the most recent video. And if you want to hang out with me and the rest of my awesome community, go follow my Twitch or join my Discord. I'll leave the links down below. Hell, check out my Patreon and the link down there as well if you want to support the channel. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time for some more RPG content.